Welcome to Life Rebounding. As we continue our study in Ephesians 1 on the identity statements that Paul gives us, I want to look today at this particular identity statement that we were adopted before we were appealing. We were adopted before we were appealing, and that's based on verse 5, where Paul writes, He predestined us to be adopted as His sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with His pleasure and will. Now, right away, some people hear a word in that verse, and they get stuck on that word. So let me try and grab that word by the horns and try and render some significance to it that makes sense for us all. And that word's predestined. Whenever people hear a word like that, they hear fatalism. They hear that everything's out of their control and that there's just this God who does things willy-nilly. Well, that's not really what's being communicated by this word. What that word communicates is that God has a plan that He's always working on behalf of His kingdom's purposes, which includes you and me. It's ultimately a good plan, always, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. And sometimes God's plan can be very difficult. Let's be honest about that. The things that we have to go through, the growth points that we have to work through, they can sometimes be very painful in our lives. But we do know that God's plan is good. That ultimately He's working everything for our good and for the good of the kingdom. And that's sort of a declaration that we need to make on a regular basis to ourselves, that God's plan is good. Can we just make that declaration today? God's plan is good. As you say that and as you think about it, let's just also recognize that that plan includes you and me. It includes us being a part of His family, where we've been adopted as family members, as sons, as daughters, which makes us princes and princesses, co-heirs with Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It means that we're a part of royalty with all the rights and privileges that go with it, not because there was anything particularly appealing about us, but simply because the love of the Father has a plan for our lives that includes us in His kingdom's purposes. Now, when I talk about being part of God's team, part of being adopted before we were appealing, one of the things that strikes me is how significant a parent can be in terms of our thinking about ourselves or thinking about others. And what I'm getting at here is when my oldest son was first born, I looked at him when I first picked him up, and I looked at my wife, and I looked back at my son, and I said, he looks like E.T. Well, that might not be the most endearing first response of a dad. It was meant in love, but there was this infant that was in my arms and loved very dearly, but he looked like E.T. He doesn't look like E.T. anymore, and he didn't for very long. But he was just the same, my son. He was a part of our family. And he still is a part of our family, obviously. But he didn't look very appealing. But he is a part of God's plan and part of our plan in our lives as a family. And so I want to remind you just today that you are a part of God's plan. You were adopted before you were appealing, before you looked like anything, before you did anything. You were loved and adopted by that one who loves you with that deep, deep love. And what this verse reminds us about also is that it brought God a lot of pleasure to adopt you. It says that it was according to his pleasure and His will that we were adopted. And so that communicates to me that we bring pleasure to God as His adopted children. We are wanted, we are desired, we are accepted, we are included. Let's live into that royal inheritance today as we seek to live our lives for Him.